Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Jill Weinstock, and I'm the director of Baxter St at CCNY, and I'm excited to provide the introduction to this artist-on-artist conversation between Spandita Malik and Eileen Quinlan, discussing Spandita's solo exhibition, Vadhu, the Embroidered Bride. Malik often addresses women's rights and gendered violence through her lens-based interdisciplinary practice. The work in Vadhu, the Embroidered Bride, uses wedding portraits as a departure point for exploring the nuanced relationship between time, gender, and memory. Spandita is a 2020 Workspace resident at Baxter St, and her exhibition will be on view through November 10th. This conversation will last approximately 45 minutes, with the opportunity for a brief Q&A portion at the end. We highly encourage you to use the chat feature to post questions throughout today's conversation. Spandita Malik is a New York-based artist from Chandigarh, India. Her work is concerned with the current global social-political state of affairs with an emphasis on women's rights and gendered violence. Malik specializes in process-based work in photography, recently exploring photographic surface embroideries and collaborations with women in India. Malik received her MFA in photography from Parsons School of Design, where she was awarded the Photography Programmatic Scholarship and the Graduate Travel Grant Award. Her work has been featured internationally in China, France, India, Italy, New York, and New Zealand. Eileen Quinlan is an artist based in New York, and she's interested in the false transparency of the photographic image. It's not a window, but a mirror. Her work presents an opportunity for contemplation, accompanied by an eruptive alienation, the mechanics of presenting and consuming images, or the social and ideological sightedness of the artist's hand, surface from the deep recesses of the substrate. Her work has been shown in solo and group exhibitions at numerous institutions worldwide, including MAMOC Vienna, the 57th Venice Biennale, the Whitney Museum, MoMA, and ICA. Her work is in the permanent collections of MoMA, the Whitney, the Metropolitan Museum, County Museum of Art, the Hammer Museum, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, France Fonds Regional d'Art Contemporain, and the Brooklyn Museum. Baxter St's programming and exhibitions are supported by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of Governor Kathy Hochul and the New York State Legislature, the Jerome Foundation, and the Fujifilm of North America. Thank you again for all tuning in, and I will now hand it over to Spandita and Eileen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Spandita Malik, and I'm going to be in conversation with Eileen Quinlan.
Hey, everybody.
Should I go ahead and share the slideshow? I'm going to give a brief introduction of the project. This series is called Vadhu, the Embroidered Bride. I started working on this series right after, or kind of in the middle of my ongoing work in the series Nari, which is a collaboration with women in India who I met with through self-help groups for domestic abuse survivors. And I started photographing these women in their houses, and I asked them to embroider on their own portrait in whatever way they wanted to. So after the pandemic that started, in the middle of all of that mayhem that sort of came upon on internationally working artists, I started to collaborate, or just in general talk with the women over WhatsApp groups, and just to check in how everyone was doing. In May 2021, when there was a surge in the pandemic cases in India, I think that WhatsApp group sort of became like a portal for everyone to ask around for resources as to how to tackle the situation and help each other out in situations of lack of hospital beds and oxygen cylinders. And that group became so important and so vital for me to know what was going on, where I was not able to go back home after the border shut down in May. I started to collaborate with them over archival images of their wedding portraits and started having conversations around them. It was really interesting to see how they looked at the photographs of their past and their memories around those photographs, that I always thought it would be interesting to see how they would embroider it and sort of take charge of this moment that some of them talked about how they didn't have any control over it. And so the photograph that we see on the screen right now is Radha, and she is one of the only women in the entire series who sort of did not ask me to crop out her husband in the portrait. And she goes in and embroiders her portrait with her husband on her wedding day.
Spandita, do you want to go through the images, or would you like to talk about Iana's?
I can go around with the images. I included this image that is from the series Nari that I started in 2019. I was sort of doing a deep dive of research on rape culture and laws around rape in general in India and how it was used in journalism. At some point, I applied for a travel grant at Parsons and got to go back home and started traveling around the states of India. I started in Lucknow in Uttar Pradesh. I went to Jaipur in Rajasthan, and I also went to Chimkorsa, which is a small village in Punjab. I started going and talking with self-help groups for domestic abuse survivors, and I learned that these women that came to the center to seek refuge would sort of learn the skills of like sewing and embroidering at the center, and this was the center's way of getting them some kind of financial freedom, so that they were not completely, dependent on the abusers and sorts. And I started interviewing these women in the self-help groups, started talking to them about what actually happened. I mean, those conversations are not really easy to have. So I wasn't really successful in actually having, getting to know the depths of what the stories were, but I could figure out the gist. At some point, one of the women sort of wanted to introduce me to her friend who did not come to the center and worked from home. So I went to her house to look at her embroidery, which was impeccable, by the way. And I realized that there was this whole community of women who were not allowed to come to the center. And they sort of worked from home. And it was for safety concerns from their husbands or their fathers in some way or the other. I started to take portraits of them. This is Nusrat Praveen in her house. She is no longer with us. She passed away during the pandemic. She is one of the oldest women in the community in Lucknow. And she has sort of taught everyone chicken curry in the community, all of the young women. And she is also sort of, she was also sort of someone that everyone looked up to for advice. All of the young women talked really highly of her, and she just had such a warmth about her. So she embroidered her portrait that I took in her room. And when I got the portrait back, it was really amazing because it was sort of washed out, the emulsion, and I could see some marks. So I asked her what happened. And she said, well, I didn't want to send you something dirty, so I washed it up and then I ironed it. So what we see on the screen right now is on the left, a little bit of like the iron marks and a lot of the emulsion that, was lost when she washed it, which I thought was really amazing. It's like the kind of thing that my mom would do. Yeah. Yeah, so the women had agency to embroider their portrait in whatever way they wanted. This is Fozia. She ended up embroidering her face underneath the veil as well and covered her identity completely. She puts henna on her hand with embroidery. She highlights parts of her garment and gives this amazing border on the side. This is Praveen Devi. I met her in Chamkaur Sahib, and the embroidery in the portrait is fulkari, which is a silk thread embroidery. It has a very rich history relating to women and women's work in general. There's a tradition that, you know, even my mom and my grandmother partake in, is that whenever you're blessed with a daughter in your family, you sort of start embroidering a scarf in fulkari to gift to her when on her wedding day. And I've seen my mom's, the one that my grandmother gave to her. So it's one of those traditions that I sort of have mixed feelings about. But at the same time, I know that there is a history to this embroidery, which is highly related to women and how they understand it as a rite of passage in a way. This is Praveen Devi in her portrait of her wedding, where she is posing in a studio with a backdrop, and she went in and embroidered. I always think that I read this portrait in a very different way than everyone else would, but that's just because I think that Fulkari also is a language, and every motif sort of has its own meaning of sort. There are like 26 motifs, and they all have a meaning. And originally, when they used to do Fulkari, they used to do it in a way that, you know, it would make a storyline in a way. And so when I look at this portrait, I always think about the motifs that she's used, which are very traditional motifs from that language. And the way that she's displayed them, I always think about the meaning, or if she was conscious of that meaning in any way. This is Rajni Mehra. She is one of the youngest women I work with. She is not married, and when I wanted her to be a part of the series, I asked her for a photograph. She didn't have any photographs of herself, so I ended up asking her if there was any kind of photograph that was available. We would work with that, and she took off a small photograph from her ration card, which is technically like an SSN card here in a way. And it was a really small photograph that she sent of herself, which made me really sad in a way, because that was the only photograph that she had, and the amount of trust that in that transaction, in all of those, you know, transaction where they would send those photographs. But hers especially, I kind of made a promise to myself that when I go back home, I take photographs of her, I'll print them out for her and give it to her. Yeah, she is one of the youngest, and I always think that the way that she embroiders her portrait is quite unique, and it's not very traditional. It does not have those traditional strokes or motifs. She's, you know, her idea of embroidery is very contemporary in sorts. The way that she embroidered on her entire portrait, I mean, the photograph in itself was so small. When I scanned and printed it, I was a little worried because, you know, it's sort of pixelated. But the way that she embroiders in Kantha, and the running stitch that goes from top to bottom, and the way that it goes in different colors and hues and changes on her face only, I think it makes it impeccably interesting. And I've been staring at this photograph for a very long time since it came back. Oh. This is Sarfaraz. I met with her in 2019. She is one of the women who I think is really, really strong, and she is a widow. In, you know, after her husband passed away, her family sort of broke ties with her, and even her husband's family did not completely accept her. She adopted a son, and now she works at the center to provide for themselves. This portrait that we're looking at right now is her wedding portrait on their honeymoon, where they went to the Taj Mahal. And her husband was on the other side of the pole in this photograph, and she asked me to crop him out. And I did, but there is a part of him, like just the part of his hand that is sort of visible in the photograph. She has, the thing is that every time they embroider, and now that they're embroidering more and more of their images, I can see some similarities in the way that they work on their portraits. She always, in some way or the other, hides her face, but she does it really beautifully. It becomes a part of the actual photograph in a way that it was intended to be there. All of the embroidery that is done on this portrait right now is Zardozi, and there's a lot of coin embroidery happening around the mask that she's built. This is Rukmesh Kumari. Rukmesh, I've been working with her for a very long time too. And she is neighbors with Praveen Devi. And the photograph, when I received it for the first time, it was really beautiful because it had its own sort of border in it that was, it sort of like marks a time that this photograph was taken in. And I think that always I'm sort of intrigued by the way that Rukmesh sort of embroiders her photographs, is because she hides a lot of things. She hides a lot of details that are present in the image, but she does it in a way that they're not, that you can't really make them out. Like there was a calendar right behind her face in the photograph, and then she puts this sort of like halo like effect around her. I always think that I'm like sort of half the viewer of my own work, so I can't really explain exactly what she meant by embroidering this, but I sort of think that she sort of wanted to make herself a goddess, and have a portrait in a way that she had full power, the way that she is in the portrait itself, and the way that she looks at you. There is immense power in that gaze already, and then she adds to it. Should I? Oh. This is Sindhu. She is sort of the in charge in Jaipur. She also gets a lot of the work orders from the center to the women. So she's sort of like a middleman, but she also works with the center and she embroiders. She has done a lot of Zardozi work. One of the most interesting things about this portrait that I thought was, apart from the fact that she asked me to crop out the husband, which is really apparent in the way that the photograph is, you can make out that it's sort of a cropped image, is that instead of doing mirror work embroidery on the border, she's added 1 rupee coins, which are, sort of like a cultural thing to add to, any sort of gift. To add like a 1 rupee coin is some sort of like, it's considered auspicious in ways. And she embroidered 1 rupee coins into the border of it, which I thought was really interesting, and also in homage to the fact that this is a wedding portrait. This is Fozia again, and these are 2 of her photographs that she sent to me. One is when she is around 6 or 7 years old, and the other one she's 12. And both of those are taken at a studio with a backdrop. And she goes in and embroiders. She has a way of embroidering that is very close to crochet. And the way that she embroiders, it's always, there's so much detail that you can't really see apart from like actually looking at the image, where it is, her dupatta, her scarf on the right, or the flowers. She sort of becomes like, the embroidery sort of becomes exactly how the image was behind it. And she just emphasizes it. She also hides her face in all her embroideries. In this, she gave herself masks. This is Radha Rani. This is her second wedding portrait, which was the official portrait that was taken that night. And she goes in and embroiders. One of the most interesting things that I found about this was that she was wearing silver jewelry and she embroidered it gold. And I don't think I would have ever noticed that if I didn't see the image and go back and forth. the figures on the bottom, I think, are sort of like a barat, which is like a wedding procession where, you know, you dance and there's music and, you know, you're taking the groom to the bride or you're taking the bride to the groom in some way or the other. And it's sort of like a celebration right before the wedding ceremony. This is Kirna Devi. She did not have a photograph of herself. So she also did send me a passport size photograph. And the way that she embroiders this is she just goes into the image and, you know, adds to the scars and the backgrounds in a way that, you know, it's already present, but you sort of have to lean in and realize that, you know, it's also embroidered. I think the way that she embroiders is always really subtle and, you know, very minimal. But one thing about Kirna Devi that I really admire is that I think she is also a very, very strong woman. She was sort of abandoned by her own family, like her sons, and her husband left and never came back. She considers herself to be a widow, and every time that she embroiders a portrait, she adds a lot of white. She also always wears white, and this is the only portrait that I have of her because this is from like way back, that she is wearing a colorful garment. This is sort of like an install shot of the exhibition up at Baxter Street right now. There are two more works in the show that are not in this image. I'm just gonna go through this. A photograph of Alex to show the perspective of how big the pieces are. Yeah. Eileen, do you have any questions that we should?
No, I have so many questions, actually.
Let's do it.
So I think, you know, it's funny as I was viewing this presentation just now, Spandita, I was thinking about something that we hadn't really discussed. And maybe I'll just start with that before I talk with you about authorship, which I think is a really important and super intriguing aspect of this project, how power goes back and forth between you as the maker and the women who are contributing their craft and their energy, and they're finding their own voices through this work. But I had a question for you, just thinking again as we went through the images online, about how you are kind of reckoning with the digital life of photographs when you're making this work, because it's really it's quite a different thing when you witness it in person than it is to be looking at these images online. And I saw them online the first time when we had our first conversation, before I was able to meet you in person and see them in the show. And there's so much about the kind of the charge of the labor that goes into creating every stitch, the imperfections, the tactile quality that they have in person that can't really be communicated in a digital space. So I just wonder, you were talking about how the younger women in this project approached embroidering their images in a different way. And I wonder if some of that has to do with their growing up maybe in a slightly more digital culture, and how some of the older women might be responding to images having come from other sources, or having more kind of generationally located notions about embroidery and about what photographs do and how they can circulate. So I just wonder how you feel about making work like this that is so incredibly detailed and really so involved with the hand, when you know it's going to be circulating in a digital space. Do you think you're thinking about the move from analog to digital in the project as a whole?
I think yeah, that's like something that I've been thinking about a lot. But I think the idea of the hand in the work is really important. And I've been like, like the last 1 year, I've been working a lot on how to make these, images as great as they are to look in person, because the embroidery completely shifts,
Yeah.
the space between what is surface of the photograph, what is the surface of the embroidery, and where the embroidery ends and the image starts is sort of, it's it's a process when you're looking at it in person versus when you're looking at it digitally. Um, but the point of, the youngest woman, Rajni, growing up with, new techniques of embroidery, it's apparent, because I know Rajni does not have access to internet as much, but Fozia does. And I know that she is always looking at, sort of all different kinds of YouTube videos and figuring out, like, how to do this new crochet trick or this new way of building a flower. And so she has, her embroidery has always, I'm just going to pull that up. Sorry.
So you see the influence of that in the work.
I do. I genuinely do. I know that these stitches that are done in the border right now, they are not something that all of the women in the community would know. I think these are the ones that she's learned online, or, looked at videos and learned over the period of time. I'm sure that she shares her techniques with all of the other women at the center, but she genuinely, I think she's one of the women I know that she looks at videos online, and she teaches herself embroideries in different ways.
When I was first encountering your work, I was thinking a lot about, well, the pictures that we first discussed were the ones that you were taking yourself when you had access to go and photograph the women in their homes and in spaces where they felt comfortable. And those pictures, they had a very different feeling, and they were, you paid great attention and care to the way they were staged. So of course they were very different kinds of portraits than the ones that we see coming out of, commercial photo studios like these, or some of the other passport photos or identity photos that some of the women had to use because they didn't have any other kind of photos, or maybe their wedding photos. So in the beginning, it was already, you were staging these images or making these portraits that reside, for me, somewhere between a document and a portrait. And then you were allowing your subjects to intervene by embellishing, by covering up, by adding sometimes totally new illustrative elements and really going off script. And from the very beginning, before I had a chance to talk to you, I was thinking and trying to imagine how you structured your engagement with them. In other words, how you directed or didn't direct them in terms of how they could work with your images. And I know that you were interested in leaving things kind of open, right? Giving them not too much direction, just saying, take this and work with it and give it to me when you're done. And some people spent a lot more time, covered much more of the image. Other people, maybe just did subtle interventions, or even, like you say, added things or subtracted things, or really completely changed the story that the picture was kind of going for on its own. So there was that aspect of the project. And then when the pandemic hit and you couldn't go and photograph them anymore, you had to really relinquish control, because they were sending you their own images, and then they were intervening on those images after you had printed them and kind of figured out how to scale them. So I guess the question of control, who has control, who has the ability to express themselves, how those things meet, and how you maintain control as the artist in this situation over what gets exhibited, how it gets exhibited, what scale it gets printed at, how much degradation or enlargement might occur in an image. All these things, I know that you are ultimately the author of this work, but how do you feel about the way that they start to express themselves and find their own voices as makers through their own approaches to the project? And how you think over time, the fact that they now see you exhibiting these works, and they see the works that I assume they see them. They see the works that the other women are making. So that starts to inform how they feel they should be responding to this call to action you're giving them. So all of that, how you keep it, how you allow them to express themselves when you kind of reclaim that control, and how you kind of collaborate with them throughout the process. I had so many questions about.
Yeah, I'm gonna start with, you know, when we started to actually make the work, when I was taking portraits of them. I was sort of reading about decolonization of photography at the time, and that was something that was always at the back of my mind. And I had this like epiphany moment of sorts at some point where I realized that all of my sort of ways of looking at photography when it comes to like being in India and looking through the lens is very colonized, because I've grown up looking at photography that way. I have only looked at photography, like great photography of India and documentary photography of India has been done through the Western eye for the longest period of time. Like even when I'm talking about it right now and you think about photography of India, there would be certain images that would come up. And if you really think about it, it wasn't done by anyone from India. And I realized that that aesthetic around Indian photography was something that was like somehow present inside of me. As soon as I looked through the lens, it was there.
Yeah.
And I did not want to become the colonizer of these photographs. Like, and that was something that I was sort of, you know, grappling. I was going through this whole equation in my mind where I was like, this cannot happen. And at that point, I was also, you know, teaching photography to the kids of the women that I was living with and, you know, working with every day, and, you know, just being there in any way that I could be involved. And I started to think about photography when I was teaching them. It was really interesting. And at that point, I realized that, well, there is a power play. There's immense power that the photographer has. As soon as you pick up the camera and you point the lens towards someone, you have immense power to portray them in any sort of way that you want. You can choose the photograph, you can choose the pose, you can choose the little moment between the smile when they're, you know, serious, to portray them in whatever way you want. And there is immense power. And how do I take this power and give it to them? And that's when I asked them to embroider their own portraits, because I was like, let's take agency over this portrait and let's see how you would do it. It was really interesting when the first portraits came back and, you know, how they'd sort of taken over the portraits. I started doing this process a little bit more when I was taking photographs, like in the beginning with Corsa, who's holding the newspaper, that was present because she was like, well, I'm not going to show my face in the photograph. And I'm like, okay, do you have any ideas as to how we can take a photograph without that? And she was like, well, I could be reading a newspaper. And then, you know, those ways of communicating became a part of the process from the beginning of taking the photograph, because I did not want them to feel uncomfortable. I didn't want them to feel like I was coming into their houses and as a stranger just walking in taking portraits. I didn't want to be that person. And also because I had gone from the idea of talking to them about domestic violence. And I was very aware of the big ask that I had already put on them. And I mean, when the photographs shifted over the last 1 year with the pandemic and they started working on their archives, it was really interesting because for me, when I was taking the photographs, I had the power to like sort of, you know, take the photograph in the way that I thought was good. But then when they started working on their archives, something different happened. They were sort of engaging with the photograph on a very different level, because what was not present in the photographs that I was taking versus the photographs that they already had was memory.
Right.
The idea of nostalgia, the idea of taking over the past, you know, the way that they would talk about the images was really interesting. You know, they would go on like this whole beautiful ways of speaking of themselves that I always thought was really interesting. The thing about these women that is really important to know is that they are all of them are like very motherly figures for me, and they have become that over the past few years. They always try to teach me stuff, even in their experiences. However they would talk about the image, they would try to tell me like, hey, you should think about this, and you should think about this. And I always take that, and I do know that that is a privilege that I have with this community. But the whole conversation around the image shifted in the way that I had not anticipated.
Sure.
And the way that they embroider the portraits is also kind of different, because they are going back into their own images and their own images of the past. So when Radha gives herself like gold jewelry, it's sort of like, a way of her taking back an agency of what she didn't have at the time.
Sure.
Or, yeah.
And I was just going to say, for them, many of these women have had abusive relationships, so they might not have. I mean, just the notion of the bride, of thinking of maybe the photographs of brides. Maybe that's one moment where a lot of these women would be photographed when they hadn't been photographed in many other situations in their lives. So maybe that's why you chose to work with bridal imagery, and we can talk about that more. But I was just curious about the kind of emotional charge that goes into contemplating and then actually physically reworking an image of, yourself. They're looking at these images of themselves, sometimes from decades ago, and maybe all the, hope or the positivity that they might have had embarking on a new life that then, didn't turn out the way they hoped it would. So I just wonder what kind of, there's definitely in the way that they embroider the pictures, and the way that they embroider over certain elements, or even cover their husbands or crop out their husbands. How I wonder like how you feel about giving them that opportunity to reflect on these images when there's been a lot of pain that needs to be kind of processed. How is that written in the images themselves?
I think the idea of the pain in the idea of the grieving has been a very big part of this particular project. The time that we were working on this was one of the most difficult times of the project. I know that the women are grieving. They've all had a lot of immense loss over the last few months. They've all gone through really horrible, as have like most of the people, but I think the situation here is more dire. There is a financial situation to consider. There is the situation of a nationalist agenda that is going around. There is religious riots that are happening, and all of that, and plus we had one of the women who passed away during this time. All of that has been, there's been immense amount of grief, and there is immense amount of grief in the photographs that is present from before. We have talked about this over and over again. I think the way that this project sort of got made was like, it was conversations, it was, grief, and it was also laughter. They would tease me, they would, try to bring each other up. And some of them are really, really good at that. They're also really good at not talking about serious stuff, and they don't want to, and change it into a joke. But it's interesting how the project sort of shifted in the way of how everyone sort of became way too, like, everyone became closer in the process. And I started to know them on a different level that I didn't know them when I was in the field working with them. And I mean, I have to thank technology for that, but it sort of worked. And I think I was getting my news of what was actually happening in India through them. Like, when they were like, yes, there are religious riots happening, they are coming around and, killing Muslims. That is actually happening on the streets right now, versus nothing's available on the news. So I was technically getting the true news from them. And I mean, yeah, the conversations around grief has been a part of this project on a very high level, I think. They always keep, as I keep telling you, they're like mother figures in ways. They all keep telling me, you just have to give it a little bit of time. It all passes away, and I think that's also sort of like their own coping mechanism in ways.
Survivors, yeah.
Exactly.
Can you tell me along those lines how, given all the different aspects of the work, the things that they're trying to express, and all the history that's occurred between the taking of these images and the reworking of them, and then your voice as a photographer who comes into their world and tries to document what you see. How do you, when you put together an exhibition like the one at Baxter Street, how do you choose which pictures to show and which ones you don't show? How do you create a rhythm between the images and allow them to kind of heighten each other and create a kind of tell a story to the viewer? How do you go about like deciding what's working and what isn't?
I always think about embroidery, first of all. That is, if there's like fulkari versus like chicken curry and zardozi, I always try to play around those lines and try to put them in conversation with each other. Second of all, is like everything that is on the wall with the 3 images in the gallery right now, they're all neighbors. So I wanted to put them together. I wanted them to have the space on the wall together. When I sent the photographs of the gallery when the show went up to the women, they were like, oh, we 3 are like together on the wall. Like that always translates. And I think that is important because when I look at the work, I think I'm like way too close to the work at this point where I sort of don't differentiate based on other things. I differentiate on the basis of how I know them and how they know each other. And I think that plays a part in the way that I sort of display them.
And I mean, the viewer might have their own associations that, of course, like the viewer wouldn't necessarily know that, but it doesn't matter. It's still, for me, like when I was standing in the show, I was thinking a lot about the scale of the different portraits and how, sometimes they feel in person more like photographs, even though they are mixed media. And other times they have like a relationship to the history of painted portraiture, given the scale and how you kind of, what it makes you think of art historically. So all those choices that you make about how you scale them based on maybe the resolution of the image that you're given or what you can do, like that, the form that the thing takes, how you attach it to the wall, whether or not you frame it, or we talked about this when I was visiting the space, whether or not you put them under glass to protect them, or you allow them to be fully available to the viewer's eyes so they can see every stitch. All of those questions, all of those decisions, I think they do kind of change the way that you ultimately read the work. So yeah, I was just thinking about like the future of this project and how you might install it in a way that some of the earlier pictures that you've taken yourself could live with these other images that the women, mined from their own archives. Is that something you're interested in putting into conversation?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it because I've been having these conversations in my mind in the way that they embroider the portrait that I took versus the portrait of their own image, and the similarities that I see because I just like lived with them in my studio for a long time. I think having them in place with each other would be really interesting to see. In the way that they embroider, I think there is a personality behind every embroidery that they do, and I can see a trail of that personality being passed from one of the photographs that they embroider versus like the other one.
Sure.
And I think that would be interesting. And yeah, I mean, the way that they are sort of displayed at Baxter Street right now is intentional in the way that, if there is a glass in front of it, I do think that the aspect of the detail of the embroidery is sort of taken away. And I like, if they are framed, but I don't think I would put them up with a glass just because of that detail.
Yeah, I was wondering too about how you plan to move forward now that you've kind of worked with their images and you've shot yourself. I believe we talked about you going back to do more work, but how do you think that work is going to change now that you've been working with these other kinds of images? Will you approach shooting the way you did before all of this happened with the pandemic?
That is a very interesting question. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I've been planning a lot because I was supposed to go back home in May, and I wasn't able to because of the border shutdown. But the borders open November 9. And I'm planning to go back home as soon as possible. And I think I've realized this after working in the field for some time, that every time I plan, things change. When
Sure.
you're in the field, things change. And what I can do to just like be on top of what I want to do is to give myself resources. I always carry books with me to read during the time. I always carry a journal to write in, because that sort of keeps me in place of what I want to do versus what's actually happening. And I think things always change, and I've learned to let loose with the idea of control, especially when I'm in the field. And I sometimes it's just like let them take charge and tell me, let's go meet someone else. Let's do that. Let's go to their house. If they're okay with us being there, let's do it. So I think that photography of the women might change in ways because I've known them on a deeper level now, but I cannot for sure know how. But I am planning to expand the project and travel to Himachal Pradesh, Kashmir, and one more state. I'm trying to get in touch with self-help groups there and see if I can collaborate or just go and like meet with women who come to the center there.
And I know this might not be something you want to fold into the project, but I enjoyed hearing you talk about your mother's involvement in this work and how, your mother, I believe, I don't know if both your parents were involved, but your mother was instrumental in getting you materials when you couldn't be in India yourself. So the idea of these groups of women that kind of support each other and, are friends and are makers and, are starting to find their own voices as people who create things and work nearby, looking at each other's embroidery and enjoying each other's work. Then you have your mother as part of the story because she was getting these materials to the women and sending them to you. So just the whole elaborate chain of transit that it took to get this work from India to you, especially in this time, in this moment in history when supply chains are disrupted. So there's just something about like the moment that we're living through that I feel like exists as another layer here, over the work. And is that something you want to explore, like making more legible in an installation, or is that something just for you?
I've been thinking about that a lot. I don't think I have the language around how to display that connection yet, but I've been thinking about it a lot because they also know my mom really well because they meet with her and they all know about her. They talk to her on the phone. And my mom has been like really instrumental. Even my dad has been really instrumental to this whole project because they've sort of been like, they've been working with the material. They've been sending the international parcels here, taking the parcels in from the women, going to the villages and actually meeting with them. We were all a little worried before May to do this because of COVID and, just like meeting with everyone. So we did a lot. We did take a lot of precautions. There was a whole depletion of N95 masks at some point. So we sent out masks from here so that, everyone had masks on them, like the basic requirement that was not available. And yeah, I think the whole system around the work has become so elaborate at this point because there's some women who do not have internet, and then there's some women who do not have they don't have phones, or there's someone who I know would go and contact them, and how my mom knows how to contact someone. There's like a whole elaborate system that has formed over the last 3 years, which is really interesting and great in ways that everyone sort of knows that this is happening and this is in place. But the way for it to actually be outside of just the story is something that I'm still working on.
I think a lot of the time you were talking about being flexible when you're in the field. And when I think about making art, I think, we have ideas about the projects that we're engaged in and where we want them to go. But very often the actual work is someplace, at the side of where we think it is, or it exists in the margins as we're working on something. Sometimes our goal-oriented brains can miss what's really happening, and that's actually what we should be responding to. So I like how you talked about having to be open in the field, but I think certainly as you work on things longer and you have all these unexpected outcomes, there are opportunities to try new things and think about other ways of working. Like you certainly probably would never have come to the idea of taking the women's own photographs if you hadn't been in the position where you couldn't do it yourself any longer. So I think that the pressure of the pandemic and the way you talked about how you helped the women and they helped each other and kind of everyone pulled together to get people what they needed, sometimes at great distances. Yeah, it created like a much more bonded community around this project. So like you said, when you go to shoot with them again, or if the same women contribute embroidery again and again in different ways on different photographs, then they start to hone their voices and they start to contribute something that's maybe even more distinct as having been made by each of them as she finds her way, in this work. So I feel like, this project, it's really just over the short time that you've made me aware of it, it's changed so much from where you started to where you are now. And yeah, I wonder, like, it's hard sometimes to locate what's for you in your own enjoyment, like knowing that the neighbor women are hanging together. That's for your enjoyment. You smile, I'm sure, whenever you see them, and they know that you're honoring them by installing it that way. But for us, we're not aware of that necessarily. So I'm always asking myself in my work, what's for me and what's for, what I'm trying to communicate. And I think that's a really rich and important question, to always kind of have in mind.
Definitely. Yeah. I agree.
Let's see.
I think now might be a great time to open it up to questions. I see we have one in the chat, but if anyone else has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or post it in the chat. And Eileen, if you have any wrap up questions,
Sure.
we can go through that now. But someone in the audience, Jenica, asks, she says, "Hi, Spandita, beautiful work. Can you talk more about your Baxter Street residency experience? Did your work change much throughout the process, or did the final show more or less fit your original ideas?"
Hello. No, it changed so much over the last 1 year in Baxter Street residency. I mean, during the pandemic, they sort of figured out ways to accommodate what was going on in the world in reality, and sort of put us all of the residents in touch with each other and like still communicate and still go through our ideas, which is really important. I think the resources that were provided by Baxter Street was also really, really important during the time, because it was sort of like a privilege to be working on art during pandemic, to be like really honest. It was a privilege. And the idea of having a community that was provided to us during that period of time to just like sit down, be on a virtual Zoom call and talk about the ideas that we were working on, that was just so important. I think the work has changed immensely, and Alex knows and Jill knows of all the ups and downs that I've gone through this last 1 year, of the ideas, the initial ideas that I came with, and the ideas, how they changed so much over the 1 year at the residency. I think it was a really, really great experience. Definitely.
I have another question, unless you want to go to another question from the audience, Alex.
No more at the moment. If anyone has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself or post it in the chat. But Eileen, yeah, go for it.
There was one thing I wanted to talk about, Spandita, which was I think I asked you at one point if you considered these to be photographs, and you talked about, how you think of your work as really as mixed media, but also as social practice. Can you talk about what you mean, what that means to you, and how you've worked with social practice work in the past, or how you want your work to continue to engage its audience in a kind of participatory way?
Yes, I do think that these works lie in the realm of social practice a lot, because of the aspect of the community and the aspect of the engagement that is like really present. I don't think that it can be taken away from the work at any point of time. Also the aspect of just like being in the field and teaching kids photography on disposable cameras, that I initially started that idea because I wanted to get close to the women and, have that sort of like a barrier break between talking about things that were, really hard to talk about, and, sort of become like this person who is not a stranger, but someone who basically just taught their kids photography. And I thought that would, ease into the process of talking about these difficult subjects.
But also what I like about that is you've realized through this project that a lot of these women don't have a lot of photographs of themselves. They don't exist in the world in that way where they're represented in images. And if you're teaching their children photography, then you're giving them the opportunity to represent themselves or to represent their families, and also to do it, like you said, thinking about like the colonial history of picturing India. They'll be doing it from their own perspectives, but probably maybe even with those images in mind. Like you said, you had to kind of pass through dismantling your own, like the way the Western view of India had informed your own view of places that you knew well and grew up in. So, but I like the idea that I know that you're teaching photography as a means of building trust with these women, but you're also empowering their kids with the ability to image themselves. So that seems really like a great outcome.
Yeah, definitely. And these kids are just so curious and also so enthusiastic because they didn't grow up with like film photography at all. They're like very used to like the phone photography wherever it's available. So the idea of the disposable camera was something that was just like so amazing to them. And the way they would develop and everything was also really interesting. And yeah, I do want to, as soon as, I've always thought of this, I always wanted to do this, was I want to go back and I want to figure out a way to create this on a bigger level where I could, just like get funding for doing photography classes in villages and teach kids photography. I think it's a great medium to open up conversations about everything else, talk about the way that you see is just so important to the way that you think. And it always makes a difference in the way that being in the field is versus, making work from like oceans apart. But yeah, I think the kids are they're just so interesting. They have such great ideas, and I ordered all of these point and shoot cameras, like digital format, so I could sort of go into photography on a higher level than what could be done on a disposable camera when I go back. So that would be an interesting step forward. Let's see how much more I can grow it into.
And it's a great skill to learn too. It might be an opportunity to earn a living from this skill. As you said, the women learning to embroider in the centers, it gives them an opportunity to maybe earn some money on their own outside of, what their husbands, give them to work with, or give them some freedom on that level as well. So photography can do that too.
Exactly. I do believe that.
Cool. That seems like a really great place to wrap up. Unless anyone has any last minute questions, we have time for maybe one more. But if not, thank you so much, Eileen and Spandita, for being here. And thank you to everyone for coming. and I'll turn it over to Jill. For some
Yeah, I echo Alex's sentiments. Thank you both for giving us such an engaging conversation and allowing us to go so deep into the work and really celebrate this poignant and important show. I think, if you all have a chance to come and see it before it closes, it really, as both Eileen and Spandita discussed, the detail and level of craftsmanship and the idea of authorship and power and control will really start to resonate when you're there in the space, really feeling the work and like having it kind of take over. So I highly support you all coming if you can. And thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and giving us this time. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us.
And thank you for introducing me to Spandita. It was great meeting you, Spandita. And I really admire what Baxter Street does, and these conversations around photography are really important to me. So thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. This is
Alex.
such an honor for me to just have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been really fun. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Have a good night. Thank you.
Night.